Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. My name is Gerry Sweeney. I'm the chair of the Parish Pastoral Council here in St. Columkills. And on behalf of our parish priest, Father Stephen McBrearty, and my colleagues from the Pastoral Council who are present, I want to warmly welcome you all to this special event this evening, especially those who are visiting our beautiful church for the first time in this special anniversary year. A very special welcome to our own parishioner Brian and Mr. Jess as well, and all his guests. Before I hand over to Mervyn, could I please mention a few of the housekeeping points? The toilets are on the porch on the right-hand side as you exit, and in case of emergency, we have an emergency door here on the right-hand side, your right-hand side, and of course the back. Finally, if you're speaking from the floor, please remember to use the roving mic, otherwise the recording won't pick that up. I hope you all have a very enjoyable evening, and I now hand over to Mr. Mervyn Jess.
Thank you very much. Who would have thought, eh? Us two older boys? Especially me. Well, there you go. That's life in this country. You never know what's going to happen next. So this book, if anybody hasn't seen it, Impossible Peace, is a collection of stories and recordings which the author, Brian Rowan, made during his time working as a security correspondent for mostly the BBC. And some of these, in fact, quite a few of them haven't been heard in public before. So things you will hear tonight may be the first time you've actually heard the spoken word by the people who actually spoke it. And that's what makes this such an important, in my estimation, learning tool, conversational tool, something for historians to look back on in time, and I mean like in 5 years' time, not even 50 years' time, do your comparisons, to do your research, to do what you need to do to put everything that's happened here over the last 30 odd years in some sort of context, because quite a lot of the stuff which was being reported, obviously not everything was being reported because quite a few things were happening, obviously behind the scenes for obvious reasons, and it was only later on that we were actually get to the bottom of it through other means. But what you're going to see and hear, and what we're going to talk about tonight, is some of that, but not all of it, because there's a lot there. So I recommend anybody who hasn't read through it to pick their copy of the book up this evening, take it home and have a good look through it, and I think it'll be something in it which will make you do this. It certainly made me do this a few times, and I worked with him for 30 years. So. First of all, I'm going to call him Barney because that's how we know him. Barney, just outline, first of all, the impossible peace and your thought processes in actually pulling what is quite a catalogue, an archive together. And why, first of all, did you decide to do it? Because you had all this stuff in a box under the bed virtually.
Yeah. Well, we started to think about it in December last year. You're right, I've got 30,000 pieces. That I gathered from the IRA, the loyalists, the security forces, the spooks, politicians, people in the church. But also what I had was this box of recordings. And these were not recordings that were done in a kind of BBC interview format. They were more conversational, shoot the breeze, if you like, where on occasions I would have gone and thrown a cassette down in front of, could have been Gerry Adams, could have been John Hume, Robin Eames, Gusty Spence, David Irvine, the former Chief Constable, Ronnie Flanagan, Dennis Bradley. Maybe I was doing some research for a book. Maybe I was just trying to get hold of it while it was fresh in their mind. But as I say, at that time, these were recordings that were not meant for broadcast. But those who are still alive, I've told them I'm applying the 30-year rule to them, that I'm going to press play on them. And others, when I listened to them, I realized I was listening to the dead. So much of the critical memory of that period has gone. There's so much about the process that we still don't know. And I suppose what I was trying to do, Mervyn, was marry the written words, the 20 contributing essays that we have in the book, with the spoken word, to see what it would contribute to some learning and memory and history of that period. The Open University, John Darcy's here, its director, came in and gave us some financial support to start with. Other funding came from the Reconciliation Fund. That didn't come until July. So with Kieran Herson, the designer of the book, Marie-Therese, myself, we took a bit of a risk in having a run at doing this because we'd committed the events in early August. The other thing, I suppose, that was my motivation behind this is 30 years ago, ceasefire was such a word of hope in this place. Hard to believe after 25 years of conflict, but here we are, 30 years on, where ceasefire in another context in the Middle East has almost become a dirty word, a word that people are afraid to speak. So our impossible peace is a success story, that the impossible peace became possible. We achieved that breakthrough. The real impossible peace is what we're looking at on our screens every night. I'm disgusted at what I see. If we felt strongly enough to condemn the events of October 7th, the Hamas attack at that period, we should be not afraid to speak out loudly about the slaughter of children and women, the erasing of lands and people, and the world leaders, the world kind of guarantors, the international guarantors that we depended on for our peace in 1994 and 1998, are looking the other way. I think that's inexcusable. I think when people look back on this period, in terms of world leadership or the absence of such, it will become such a period of shame. So those were kind of the thoughts behind it when we started to put this together.
And you mentioned, our own conflict, obviously, not on the scale of what's happening
of course.
In the Middle East at the minute, but still, for those who are affected by it, death is death. When it's rained on you from wherever, people lose their loved ones. They never get them back. They live with the memories. You can see that in legacy issues, which are still very alive today, obviously. So you think about what was said at the time when things were happening here, and the atrocities that did take place, and the political fallout from that, and then what was said by various community voices, religious voices, political voices. Those are where you're saying there are lessons to be learned from what was said, how that worked itself out, how long it took to get that worked out. Is that what you're saying, that's why people from other parts of the world, not just the Middle East, but other parts of the world where they have conflict, look to this place sometimes to say, well, look, if they can crack that nut, well, surely there's something for us, there's a lesson there to be learned.
Well, I think we've got some learning that we can share. And, our learning from 1994 is that we had leaders, with John Hume, with Adams and McGuinness, with loyalist leaders at that time, the emerging voices of David Irvine and David Adams and Gusty Spence's voice at that stage, but also with international support. Clinton had bought into a peace process here. His administration had bought into a peace process here. The Taoiseach at that time, Albert Reynolds, had bought into a peace process here. So if it had been left to ourselves, would we have got there? It would have taken a lot longer. But I think the story that we tell in Impossible Peace is the kind of the backstage story that was going on before the ceasefires emerged. And we're going to play some audio tonight. And the first clip we're going to play to you is from Dennis Bradley. And Dennis was part of a back channel. 3 Derry men involved in it. Dennis Bradley, Brendan Duddy, and Noel Gallagher. And they were a link that allowed the British government to communicate with the IRA leadership. And when that story blew up in November 1993, the British government tried to justify the contacts, having denied them for months. John Major and the then Secretary of State, Sir Patrick Mayhew, tried to justify the contacts by saying they had received a message in February 1993, which they attributed to Martin McGuinness, that the war was over and they needed British help. And of course, Martin McGuinness denied having sent any such message. He had said the complete opposite of all of that to me in an interview, coincidentally, in March 1993. But it took Dennis Bradley, I think, the guts of 6 or 7 years to finally admit that he had sent the message to the British government. And he made the comment that you're no good as a mediator if all you do is mediate. He knew that these two sides wanted to talk. and he thought that they had to do something to bring them together. He talked about holding 2 live wires in their hand at that stage, the IRA and the British government, and those in the back channel decided to put the wires together, blow themselves up. But it took Dennis 7 years to get round to saying it was him. You'll hear him in this clip, and as I explained, these are not interviews that were meant for broadcast. He's smoking his pipe. He doesn't take it out of his mouth for the entire interview. You'll hear the sound of striking matches. It's him lighting his pipe and then throwing them into the bin. So I asked him, this is March 2000, tell me a little bit about that message that went to the British. So this is Dennis Bradley.
Mayhew says the February 93 message, the conflict is over, we need your British advice,
Yes.
was sent by McGuinness.
Yes.
And Major says in his autobiography it was sent by McGuinness.
Yes.
Who was it sent by?
I wrote it.
You wrote it.
Yes.
Based on what, Dennis?
Based on the whole, my interpretation of what the Provost wanted to have.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
You're no good as a mediator if all you do is mediate.
Yeah.
At one stage or other, you have to make a big decision.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to say, well, these two people want to move,
Mm-hmm.
but they're incapable of moving.
Yes.
Now, how do you get rid of the roadblock?
Yeah.
The three of us got together,
Yeah.
and I sat in my office and I wrote the thing.
Mm-hmm.
But we made it up.
Yeah.
Because all we were, and we didn't say where it came from. We just says, this is where the Provosts are at.
Right.
Right? We didn't say it came from
When you say you made it up, Dennis, what do you mean you made it up?
we wrote it.
You wrote it.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, we're no good to anybody unless we actually interpreted what was going on.
Right.
Right? You remember, the great thing about mediation is
Mm-hmm.
that if you have mediators in between, the boys outside don't always know. The danger of mediation for two groups of people is they don't know what the boys who are mediating
Mm-hmm.
actually are saying.
Yes.
Right? And who
Mhm.
said what
Mm-hmm.
until you put them face to face.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yes.
So that's the strength of mediation.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
But unless you're prepared to, you don't do that too often, by the way.
Yes.
You do that once too often, you're dead.
Do that once too often, you're dead. Yeah, so it's, so it was a huge risk, and I suppose part of the learning as I look back on 30 years is the risk-taking that is absolutely necessary in peace. The other big player in the background before the ceasefires emerge is Father Alec Reid, the Clonard priest, and we'll ask Tom Hartley in a little while to talk to us a little bit about that. But I remember going to see Gerry Adams in March 1995. I met him in Sevastopol Street, the Sinn Féin office in Sevastopol Street. Loyalists had fired a rocket at it in March 1993, a year previously. So the windows were filled in with breeze blocks on the inside. I can remember meeting Jim Gibney in that office the week before the IRA ceasefire, and there was a hole in the ceiling. You could see from upstairs downstairs without actually going downstairs. And but I remember when I met Gerry Adams that day, there was a teapot brewing on top of a gas heater. So he was talking to me about these very important matters of the peace process, and you get up to pour the tea and get the milk. But one of the questions I asked him about at that stage was the role of Father Alec Reid. And it's one of those moments when he starts to speak to me and then he pauses to correct himself. So I'll just let you hear this little clip of Gerry Adams.
An awful lot has been speculated about the role of Alex Reid in all of this. Is there anything that you can say on the record which sums up his role or puts his place in the picture into some sort of context?
Well, I wanted to include him by name, and I actually, that revised edition that I gave you, or what I'm going to give you, I actually got his permission to name him, and then he asked me to take his name out of it.
Right.
So even in this, I don't want to refer to him by name.
Yes.
We would not. I might have said this about John Hume, but we would not have even the possibility of a peace process if it wasn't for the unstinting, patient, diligent work of the third party. There's no doubt that he was the constant in all of this, and in the development of relationships between the key players.
So that's Adams, even a year after the ceasefire, still not wanting to name Alec Reid publicly, and he said the reason that Father Reid had, having given Adams permission to name him then, withdrawn that permission was because Reid thought, this is not over. There was still work to be done. I'm going to play a couple of little clips now of John Hume, because the other big important ingredient before we get to the ceasefires is the dialogue that John Hume engaged in with Gerry Adams. Vilified by political opponents, attacked by the media, much of it in the South, and from people who should have known better and didn't know better, pontificating from afar, even though they weren't that many miles away from us. But I met Hume in the BBC Club. We used to have one of those. And it was February '95. He was drinking black coffee, smoking his head off, fidgeting with his lighter throughout the conversation I had with him. And he just struck me as a man who was wrecked and damaged by the effort that he had put in to achieve the ceasefire of '94. The story that he was speaking to Gerry Adams broke in 1993. But in the first of these clips, John Hume explains that they had been speaking secretly for a lot longer than that. And what convinced him that Adams was serious was that they were talking during the 1992 general election, where Adams lost the seat to Joe Hendren in West Belfast. And he believed the fact that Sinn Féin didn't leak the dialogue at that stage was an indication of seriousness in terms of the bigger challenge of peace. So this is John Hume.
When it emerged in April '93 that we were talking, we had been talking for 18 months before that.
So you were meeting
Secretly.
Adams privately, secretly?
Yeah, we had been meeting for a long time, and we were also meeting. We'd even met during the '92 elections, and in fact, the fact that they didn't leak out our dialogue demonstrated to me how serious they were, because had they leaked it out during those elections, it would have helped them a lot, you know. Throughout my dialogue, I realised that Gerry Adams was totally straight with me in what he was saying to me, and I think he accepted that I was totally straight with him. In other words, in spite of our deep differences, a great deal of personal trust in our respective point of views built up.
The second little clip that I'm going to play from John Hume is where he describes that period of criticism, the political and media attacks of '93 into '94, his party being attacked at that stage as well. But he realised that there was a big prize and the importance of keeping going.
Given what I had been through, which was the worst period of my life, in a sense, that I had been subjected to incredible attacks from sections of the media and politicians, but I knew what I was doing. And if I'd just been playing politics, I would have just chucked it. But I realised there was a real opportunity here to save human lives.
Yeah, a real opportunity to save human lives. I'm going to play one more clip, and then we're going to ask Tom and Joanne to say a few words. But so this clip is Gerry Adams again speaking to me in March 1995, and we're 7 months into the ceasefire at this stage. Negotiation hasn't begun. Talks haven't begun. And already there is concern about whether or not the ceasefires would last. And this is Gerry Adams, and you will hear in this clip, it's not the Gerry Adams you would hear in a TV studio, because he speaks quite openly here about the IRA and understanding the IRA as an organisation.
Whatever decision the IRA would have taken, I would have understood it. Had the IRA decided, in its wisdom, that what was being put to it was not good enough, because it is a very high risk strategy, and if there was courage shown in the situation, no matter whether people think the IRA campaign should ever have happened or not, it took remarkable courage to actually take the decision that was taken on August 31st, and to place the whole struggle from the IRA's point of view on on the edge. Now, I understand where the IRA comes from. I understand what makes it tick. I also firmly believe that Republicans only resort to armed struggle as a last option, as they see it. So there was a big onus on others, especially those who merely dealt with the politics of denunciation, to come up with some sort of alternative way of bringing about peace and justice. Now, whether this alternative way we're involved in will have that effect remains to be seen. We have to remove the causes of violence, causes of conflict. What is now an opportunity, it's now a cliche, best opportunity in 75 years.
Yes.
No one knows.
Yes.
Me, you,
No.
Dublin, London.
Whether it's
No
going to work,
one
you mean?
knows how it's going to work.
Yes.
No one knows. No one can call it. And what of course is clear is if we don't remove the causes of conflict, we will indeed have not only squandered the best opportunity for 75 years, but the causes of conflict will nurture, will fester, will resurrect.
Yes.
And that isn't, when I say things like that, never refrain from saying it, because it's taken as a threat. It isn't a threat, it's a statement of fact.
Just before you
Yeah,
move
yeah.
on to the next, let's emphasise just at this moment in time, having heard all those clips, the level of risk, which is coming through loud and clear there by those who are speaking, the level of risk taken by all of them in that particular time and from those particular positions, huge. Hard to believe in some respects that some people would have stuck their neck that far out at that particular time.
Well, lives on the line. The loyalists thought about killing John Hume. They targeted his party. There was a big focus of attacks on Sinn Féin at that stage as well. This constant reference to the Hume-Adams dialogue as a reason for an escalation in loyalist violence to the point where they threatened the entire nationalist electorate and Catholic community. And I said at a meeting with some loyalists just Saturday week ago that what they have to understand is that without Hume-Adams, there wouldn't have been an IRA ceasefire and there wouldn't have been a loyalist ceasefire. So when we think about it now, and a little bit later we'll hear from others such as Robin Eames, the former Archbishop Robin Eames, who took big risks in this stage. And it's a lesson that you've got to fight for peace. You've got to take risks for peace. I think about the leadership of those people in that period and the absolute lack of leadership that we're seeing in the world at the moment as that slaughter continues in the Middle East. Father Reid and John Hume are no longer with us, no longer able to talk for themselves, but we do have Tom Hartley here, former Sinn Féin Lord Mayor, an historian, who was involved in the very early stages, or at the very early stage of the SDLP Sinn Féin dialogue, which began in 1988. So Tom is going to say something about the role of Clonard, the role of Father Reid, and then Professor Joanne Murphy, is going to speak on John Hume. Both have written contributing essays in the Impossible Peace book. Tom under the heading of the Clonard House Rule, and Joanne under the heading of Hume Changing the Rules of the Game. Tom, we have a mic here. You come and join Joanne. You'll stand, Tom, and we don't mind if you stand.
Well, you can sit if you want, Tom. Don't have to stand.
It's hard on the old feet. What sort of man was Father Reid? I told a story about it once. A few years ago, Barney, we brought the All-Ireland Tipperary hurling team to Cutterland on the Falls Road, and it was a session about Father Reid. Because in his youth, Father Reid played hurley for Tipperary. And I related this story that I had heard about Father Reid, that at one point in his life, he was faced with a dilemma. And the dilemma was this: either he play in an All-Ireland final for Tipperary, or he joins the seminary. And of course, what did he do? But he went to the seminary. And then I posed the question to the crowd I was speaking to at the time, the All-Ireland hurling champions, senior champions. And I could see them all draw back when I said, you know, there was a very basic weakness in Father Reid. Because you have to ask yourself, what sort of man would put God before the GAA? And that was Father Reid. I knew him. I suppose I can use this occasion to tell you something about myself, which you probably didn't know, or you may know. But I am a lapsed Clonard altar boy. And
Welcome to the crowd. Anything you want to know, just ask.
So, my family have been connected to Clonard all. My grandfather was in a confraternity, and my father was in a confraternity. I used to say my father was one of the pillars of Clonard. So I knew all the Redemptists from a very early age. And in the 1960s, when Father Reid came to Belfast, I got to know him, and he was very friendly with my mother at the time. So I knew him, and he would come in and out of the house at times. So I had a good sense of him, and I had a good sense of Clonard. And I had a good sense of the Redemptist and the culture of the Redemptist, which in many ways is very open. And you can see that even today in those who attend Clonard Monastery. But so I got to know Father Reid, and during the conflict then, we would often have meetings in Clonard Monastery, and and these meetings were kept secret for years, and we met all sorts of people there. And when the peace initiative, as we called it, started in the 80s, we started to meet all sorts of people. One of the difficulties for Sinn Féin at the time was that we really didn't have a good communications with Unionists or the Unionist community. So therefore, we opened up a dialogue with the Protestant churches in a way to create that sense of getting to know what was on the other side of the hill, because we didn't. And those meetings, we met all sorts of people. And I would like to pay tribute, because I, in my bitterness, see all sorts of people claiming the peace process today. But let me tell you, out there are many, many individuals who are peacemakers, and they are unknown. And they stuck their necks out, and they dialogued, and they talked. And the talks were, they weren't easy. It could be quite difficult and emotional. The talks could be painful. And out of that process, we started to get a sense of in a sense, what was taking place in the northern Protestant community. And I think on reflection, and it is only a reflection of mine, but making peace is much more difficult than making war. It's much more difficult. It needs managed. And what is the fundamental essence of making peace? You humanize the enemy. So in war, you demonize the enemy. You take away the personality of the human being. You take away any sense of a rational, understanding, caring human being, and you put in place a stereotype. Whereas when you make peace, the exact opposite is what shoots into place, what becomes the norm. That is, you get to know people. You get to hear what they think, to engage. And it impacts in a very big way, I think. It certainly did in me. One of the first lessons I had to learn was to listen to myself. You don't think that of politicians. Politicians go out there and they give their spiel. But you have to listen to yourself and how you impact. And I think the genius for me of Mr. Adams, the genius is that when Mr. Adams was negotiating, he wasn't just negotiating with a British government or another party. He was negotiating with his base at the same time. And that understanding of how you bring a community along with you was essential. And there's so many other lessons. And all of that, I think, came out of that whole period of engagement. So that engagement, of course, happened a lot in Clonard, and I was in and out of its rooms for many, many years. Father Reid was a quiet man. He's an easy man to talk to. Wasn't overbearing, wasn't even righteous. He was just a nice man, and often didn't say much. But one of the things that I got to know about him was that he was a bulldog. You never saw it in him. There was no sense of aggression from him. There was no sense that he was headbutting you. No sense that he was trying to get you to think in a particular way. But nevertheless, his role, as I see it, in the peace process was so central, in that I think we can rightly claim that Clonard Monastery is the birthplace of the Irish peace process. And he was dogged, but you never saw that. But I knew it of him, that his commitment to the peace process was so deep that he just kept going and going, never took no for an answer, just kept going. And of course, where Clonard is situated, it makes it very real for Alex Reid in that Clonard sits right on the dividing line between the Shankill Road and the Falls Road. And in the 1920s, on the 21st of July 1920, there was a brother Morgan looking out the window of Clonard, and he was shot dead by a British Army sniper. So they knew what was taking place. They had a sense of where, in terms of their location, of what peace and making peace was all about. And I mean, in some ways, it is difficult for me to, it'd be great to come in and say, Father Reid was great at this and great at that, but that wasn't his style. His style was quietness. His style was persistence. His style was making sure the engagement took place. And I think that, he was an extraordinary man. He's buried in Milltown Cemetery because, in a way, he loved Belfast. Once he came to Belfast, he became a part of us, and I mean all of us. Him and Clonard Monastery have so much, I think, to be proud of. And so have the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the members of Iconi and the Church of Ireland and the loyalist and all the people, the Quakers that we met in those days. They are a silent majority, and they made peace, and they made peace happen. So I just want to acknowledge that tonight, that the making of peace most people, I think, don't realise the extent of what was going on and the people who were involved, who did stick their necks out.
Thanks so much, Tom. Thank you.
Can you just get the microphone to Joanne?
Yeah. Just before Joanne speaks, there's a line that Tom left out, and Mervyn writes an essay in the book on the killings of the two corporals in 1988. Part of that horrendous week of the stone attack on the Milltown Cemetery and the funerals of the three IRA members who'd been killed in Gibraltar. One of those weeks when we thought we were walking to the very edge and we might fall off the edge. And of course, and Tom talked about Father Reid being very private, but there was a very public picture appeared of him praying over one of the corporals. And he was carrying an envelope that day, which Tom Hartley had given him. A position paper from Sinn Féin to go to John Hume in Derry, and the blood of one of the corporals. ended up on that envelope. And Father Reid had to return to Clonard before making his journey to Derry. But in that moment, none of us could see peace, but peace was being worked on. And I just hope that while we can't see any possibility in the Middle East at this time, that there is something happening in the background that might change all of that.
The photograph of Father Reid basically praying over, giving the last rites effectively to the dying soldier went global, obviously.
Of course.
And there was, in photographs as well, you noticed he had blood on his face around about there, because he'd been given the kiss of life to this dying soldier who'd been shot after being beaten by the crowd and taken away and then shot. So here was a Catholic priest in West Belfast doing the polar opposite to what had just been done to the same soldier by the crowd who thought that he was there to attack them, as had happened at the Milltown Cemetery's funerals just a few days earlier when Michael Stone opened up with guns and grenades. So again, the juxtaposition of those two incidents and the photographs that flowed from both of them would give anybody, enough food for thought for a generation, and probably still is to this day for many people.
Of course.
Joanne, we're going to like to bring you in. Perhaps you would like to shed a bit of light on John Hume and his particular role at that time as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna talk about a few things really. Some of it relates to what we've spoken about already, and then I'll move on to Hume and the significance of Hume in the process, and why I suppose I felt so privileged to be able to write a piece on Hume for the book and some other work as well. The first thing is just to reiterate, I suppose, the comments that have been made about the Middle East. Whenever the events that you have been talking about this evening were happening around kind of 93, 94, 95, I wasn't in Northern Ireland. Actually, I was in the West Bank and Gaza. So the places that you're seeing bombed, the people that you're seeing bombed, those were the people I was with. Whenever I lived in Gaza, I lived in Jabalia refugee camp. That's the place that's being carpet bombed at the minute by the Israelis. And I was working on a project a couple of years ago. We had a lot of Palestinian partners for that project. All the Palestinian partners were in Gaza, and we have heard nothing from them in months and months. And at this point, unfortunately, I don't really feel like I'm in a position to try to contact their contacts outside Palestine, because I think if we do, we'll find out that those people are no longer with us. And so this is the reality of conflict. This is the reality of these connected conflicts all around the world. And this is why this type of work, these types of conversations, and actually really, and I would really like to pay tribute to Brian and to his colleagues as well, this is why these kind of archives are so incredibly important, because without these archives, we lose these histories, and these hidden histories of what seem to be impossible peace processes are absolutely critical in terms of how we see these processes develop and how we can move from the past, hopefully, into the future. And there were very, very dark times in Northern Ireland, and you've just heard about probably the worst 10-day period that many of us remember. And there are very dark times around the world at the minute, but hopefully, if we can hang on to some of that hope, there might be some better times to come. One of the other, I suppose, things which got me very interested in this project and very interested in Hume, and I kind of was interested in Hume already, but one of the reasons why Hume has become quite significant in my academic work recently is that I was doing a piece of work more generally in the peace process, which involved a huge amount of interviews, particularly with officials from the Irish government in particular, but others beyond that. And one of the things I can say about John Hume is that he completely wrecked that research project. Because I was doing that research project about other people. I was talking about the kind of wider kind of building of peace. But for very many people who I spoke to, and I had long periods of time with whenever I was doing those interviews, the only thing they wanted to talk about was John Hume. And whenever John Hume died, I was one of the people who was privileged to be able to write a little piece in the Irish Times about Hume. I have to say, I don't envy the position of journalists, because I was asked to write, 500 words in 40 minutes, which I'm sure that's like bread and butter for you lot. But for me, I kind of felt a wee bit under pressure. But one of the things that I said in that piece is it was really kind of drawn from the research that I'd done, and that was a quote from a senior Irish official who said, there were many people who were critical to the peace process in Northern Ireland, but with only one without whom it would not have happened, and that was Hume. And he was the centre of the matrix. Now, Brian this evening asked me to talk about Hume in relation to how Hume changed the rules of the game. And just before we started, I said to Brian, tell me, you might remember, was it 1964 that Hume wrote 2 articles in the Irish Times?
I was 6.
And yeah, well, I kind of thought your encyclopedic knowledge of the peace process, But when you think of this, so 1964, Hume writes 2 pieces, in the Irish Times on the basis of the principle of consent. Okay, so we're talking about changing the rules of the game, something which went out to slaughter the sacred cows of his community, his tradition of nationalism, of republicanism, something which was massively, enormously controversial at the time. In 1964, so pre-Troubles, before things have really kicked off as they would a few years down the line. So when we talk about changing the rules of the game, that's how far we have to go back when we think about Hume's contribution. We're going right back as far as that. But that's not the only thing he did. What he also did was to create a new language. So a lot of the language that we use about the peace process is Hume's language. He created what some of my academic colleagues have called linguistic space. So we think about things like taking the gun out of Irish politics. We think about people, not territory. We think about all of those kind of phrases, a new Ireland that Hume grabbed and popularised and then talked about incessantly until we were all so bored of hearing them. Okay, the single transferable speech. But what did Hume say about that? Well, I started off very briefly as a teacher. And whenever you're teaching, you have to tell people something until they start to say it back to you. Okay? Very interesting way of thinking about things, isn't it? So we created this linguistic space. He begins to change how we begin to understand what Irish unity is, what a new Ireland is, how we begin to think about all of those central concepts in a different way. And he does everything he can to try to move the process along. But one really interesting interview that I did was with Pat Hume, and I was really lucky to be able to speak to her. Sadly, she is gone as well now. And she talked about a really critical time in the very, very early days, whenever everything was collapsing. Sunningdale had collapsed. Things were not looking good at all. And Hume had come off the phone and he turned to her and he said, "This is no good. None of this is working. If we're going to fix this problem, we need to make it bigger." So you see, whenever we talk about fixing problems, very often we talk about what? Breaking them down, trying to identify their constituent parts. But that wasn't what Hume did. That's when he went to America. So he made the problem bigger. He got the problem on the agenda in America. He got the problem on the agenda in Brussels. He spent his time wandering all around the world, making the problem bigger so the problem could be resolved. Which is really interesting, isn't it? Because it's not a way that we tend to think about peace building. And then, of course, the thing that everybody thinks about when they think about Hume Adams, the idea that he was prepared to put absolutely everything on the line and to do it publicly, to do it absolutely publicly in a way that made him an extraordinary figure of hate. And if you go back and you read the sort of stuff that was being said then, the sort of stuff that was being written then, as Brian says, by people who frankly should have known better and should have been able to see further. It is quite extraordinary what he was able to achieve and what he was able to go through, and the challenges of that, and the real difficulties of that, and that level of bravery. And again, there's a thing called hindsight bias that we academics like to talk about. You know, the fact that after the event, you're able to see everything much more clearly, but that wasn't after the event. He was prepared to put absolutely everything on the line, his political party, his reputation, everything that he had held dear, his complete belief in non-violence. He was able to put all that on the line at a point where he didn't know what was going to happen next. He didn't know what the next steps were going to be, and yet he was still prepared to do it. And that, I suppose, leads me to, I think, the last thing which is really significant about Hume. And I suppose this is probably the most difficult and the most challenging thing about his position. And that was his awareness of and his willingness to sacrifice. So whether it was around sacrificing his own reputation, whether it was around sacrificing his and his family's safety, whether it was around sacrificing his political party and his colleagues, whether it was sacrificing the sacred cows of Irish republicanism or nationalism, whatever those things were, he was prepared to let them go for one purpose. And it's been mentioned already, it was in that clip, because it might save lives. It might save human lives. And when we look around the world at the moment and we look at the dreadful, dreadful situation that we have in the Middle East, we see why that really matters. Hume said, you can take people out of prisons, but you can't take them out of their graves. And that is the fundamental reality of conflict. That, in the end, is fundamentally what it comes down to. So I was really privileged to be able to write a little bit about Hume. You can have a look at it in the book if you get a chance. There's a longer form piece, which is open access, which if anybody wants, you can contact me at the University of Birmingham or on Twitter as well. You know, I do tend to retweet Barney quite a lot, so you'll be able to find me pretty easily if you want to know more about this. But please do have a think about some of those things, because that level of bravery, that level of sacrifice, that level of intelligence, that ability to be able to see beyond what others can see is probably the most significant issue in terms of leadership, which is what I'm interested in, but it's also the most significant issue in terms of moving us out of these dreadful times that sometimes we get ourselves into.
Joanne and Tom, thank you very much for
very
those
much indeed.
insights. Thank you.
Will we bring Jackie and John up? Yeah, okay.
So, moving it on, or moving it over, let's bring in the loyalist side of the House. David Irvine was obviously a well-known, probably the best-known loyalist spokesperson throughout his time in the media and as leader of the PUP as an MLA. Barney, you were very close to him. We know that. So for you, I know it's probably more difficult to talk about it, but put your journalistic hat on right now, rather than your friend hat, and give us the little bit of a insight into where do you think David sits in the peace process, and more importantly in the House of Loyalism and bringing them on board.
Well, he was one of those remarkable voices that emerged in that period of the mid-1990s. The first interview I did with him was early '94. He was like a rabbit in the headlights, nervous, so many notes in front of him. We fell out afterwards. He told me I wouldn't make a patch on a correspondent's backside. He said something worse than that, actually, but
you're in church.
I'm conscious of where I am at the moment. And but we built a very good working relationship where we came to understand I had a job to do and he had a job to do. But you'll remember that after the IRA ceasefire announcement of August '94, loyalists had a number of questions they wanted answered before they would respond. And this is where another of the quiet peacemakers emerges, Archbishop Robin Eames. And I think we're going to, have you got the order there of the clips? We're going to hear David first. So David, the foundation stone of the loyalist ceasefire was this statement that the Union is safe. And when I was doing this project, I found this tape marked 8th of November 1994. So it's not even a month after the loyalist ceasefire. And I pressed play on it. It was David Irvine. I was talking to him in the Raven Club, the bottom of Castlereagh Street there, facing the the short strand. He called it his office. And the line that he speaks in this little clip, it must have gone in one ear and out the other, you know, which is an indication of that kind of blizzard of news you're in at that stage, where it's only when you listen back to something many years later you realise the significance of it. He says something entirely different about the union at this stage, and I'll let you hear the clip before we go any further.
Is this real? The question that the world and its dog asked. Is this real from the IRA?
Yes.
Well, if it's not real from the IRA, how do they get off the hook? By loyalist violence would be the only option. So the loyalist paramilitaries then believed that the best option was to match the IRA ceasefire. Some would say tactically. We will reciprocate, because remember, it always had been said that loyalist paramilitary violence was reactive.
Yes.
But then there's always a rider to that. Loyalist paramilitary is reactive as long as the union is safe.
Yes.
Right? Now, that brings me to the point, well, how do you come to the terms where the union is safe? And the union is safe is basically an assumption. There would be those within unionism and loyalism who would be shattered to hear me say that, but it is an assumption. It's not a complete assumption, but elements of it are assumption. And the element of assumption, quite frankly, is that there are so many big reputations riding on a peace in Northern Ireland who have said there are no secret deals, who have said that there will be consent and democracy and all those things that you know and I needn't talk about. That being the case, if they are liars, and I doubt that they are, what effectively you would do, you would give loyalism and unionism the moral high ground in any future difficulty that may arise. And I don't think they'd be prepared to do that. Whether it be John Hume, Albert Reynolds, John Major, Archbishop Eames, Cathal Daly, doesn't matter, Uncle Tom Cobley, and all have said there are no secret deals. Essentially, Northern Ireland will remain part of the United Kingdom until the greater number say otherwise.
Consent determines
the union, therefore, is safe.
I told a loyalist that I had that tape only a couple of months ago, and he said to me, had you played that on the 8th of November 1994, the balloon would have gone up. And someone suggested to me I didn't play it because it would have been damaging to the peace process. I said, that's absolute nonsense. I didn't play it because I didn't understand the significance of what he was saying at that time. You know,
but could you imagine if it had got out some way?
Yeah.
In today's world of social media,
of course,
where anybody can misconstrue it, misrepresent it, cut it up any way they wish, and stick it out. How much more difficult the situation would have been?
You can imagine Paisley and Molyneux in November '94 about an assumption that the union is safe. The other big line in the loyalist ceasefire were the words that Gusty Spence read, where he expressed remorse, and everyone thought at that time that what he was talking about was a statement of apology for innocent Catholics killed by the loyalist organisations. But when I went to speak to him, and I think this is early '95, January '95, again he's smoking on his pipe. He's in his little front room in his house off the Shankill. He explains that statement of remorse in a much wider context.
When I read that statement out, I wasn't reading that statement simply for the Combined Land and Military Command. I simply wasn't reading that statement for Gusty Spence. I was reading that statement for every genuine person out there who had felt remorse about anything ever that had happened in Northern Ireland. From a personal point of view, I wasn't speaking about 25 years. I was speaking about every injustice that had been perpetrated by Protestant on Catholic or Catholic on Protestant or government on people of whatever hue. That's what I was speaking about. I was speaking about all time. I wasn't necessarily speaking about the past 25 years, although that was the catalyst that brought this to the conclusion which we have today. I was speaking for all time.
So that much wider explanation of it. The other thing that I found out shortly after the loyalist ceasefire announcement in 1994 was that the then Archbishop Robin Eames was involved in some quiet dialogue with what was then called the Combined Loyalist Military Command. And early in 1994, the Loyalists were thinking about announcing their ceasefire first. They were thinking of getting in ahead of the IRA, taking the agenda, if you like. And they brought this to Robin Eames. This was never published, this document. It says delivered by messenger, March 1994. But basically what this statement was doing was setting out the terms for a loyalist ceasefire. And they asked Eames would he bring that to John Major, the Prime Minister at that stage, and that if these terms were met, the loyalists would go first. They would announce their ceasefire before the IRA. And Eames shared the thinking in this with both John Major and with Albert Reynolds, the Taoiseach at this time. So I went to see him in November 94. This document had not been made public at this stage. And you'll hear on this tape that he starts to talk to me about this document and then realizes he probably shouldn't be talking to me about it. So we'll let you hear this little clip of Robin Eames.
They asked me if I would look at something in a document form showing what their concerns were. Now, Brian, have they agreed that that is known, that they have a position document? Because I agreed at that point that that document would be entirely private.
Well, I have found it out, and I will address that point with them.
Would you mind making sure? Because I don't want them to think that I welched on that. So would you check that? I read the document, and I said to them, I am not a negotiator, but nevertheless, as the British government has said it will not negotiate with Sinn Féin, I couldn't see that there would be negotiations on these, but I would have thought in a ceasefire situation, most of these could be addressed, but addressed in a dialogue situation, not down the barrel of a gun.
He wrote to me, Robin Eames wrote to me a couple of days after he did that interview. There were a couple of things he had omitted to say on tape. He wanted to address this question of the dilemma of being a church leader condemning violence at that stage, the violence continuing when he had begun that quiet dialogue with loyalists, but that kind of moral dilemma of how do you condemn them and then refuse an opportunity to speak directly with them to try to persuade them to stop. And he had another little paragraph in his letter to me that throughout that dialogue that he was having, he had kept the then Archbishop of Canterbury fully informed of the dialogue and where it might go. And the Loyalists let Eames read their ceasefire statement a couple of days before it was announced. And when he read those words of remorse, he said to me his reaction was simply to thank God that at least some of the things he had maybe said to them along the way had registered, had got through. But we have two people with us now.
Yeah, we're joined by Dr. John Kyle, who actually succeeded David Irvine as leader of the PUP at the time, and also leading loyalist and spokesperson on loyalism, Jackie MacDonald. So maybe start with you, John, since we're just coming off the back of David Irvine. You know, he was a hard act to follow, you could say.
Yes, and to be quite clear, Don Purvis succeeded David as leader, and then when Don stood down, I found myself thrust into that position. So I have to say I've got an acute case of imposter syndrome here. So I will tell you what I know, but I don't want to. But I'm a post-ceasefire soldier, so I can't claim any medals for being involved in these very difficult and risky discussions and negotiations that took place. But I did get to know David very well. I was at school with his brother Brian, his older brother Brian, and then I knew Brian well. And when David then emerged on the scene, I was talking to Brian about it. And I decided I was so impressed by David. We had invited him to our church. He was there with Alec Atwood. It was a brilliant night, the pair of them sparking off each other. And I was so impressed that I thought, I want to do whatever I can to support this man, because he is clearly saying things and doing things that no other unionist politician was prepared to do or say. So I wanted to lend my support to him in whatever way I could. And so I just simply looked up the PUP in the Yellow Pages. If you remember, we used to have Yellow Pages. And I rang them up and said I'd like to join. I think the person in the end thought I was a hoax caller.
MI5, I think they thought.
Exactly. So eventually they said, well, your local branch meets on the Newton Ards Road the first Thursday in every month. Why don't you go along? And I did. And through that, then I got to know David quite well. So, you see, I came here to listen tonight, and then I've been handed a microphone.
You're doing very well now. So, but it was obviously his influence that brought you into politics.
Yes,
You mentioned Alex Atwood.
Yeah.
David called him Alex Attitude, I think was the name he had for him. But he had that way with words, John. He surprised us, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was riveting when he spoke. It was both the vocabulary that he used, and they used to talk about him in loyalist circles as the man who swallowed a dictionary, as is the name of the play now. So people sort of, pulled his leg a bit about all these complicated words and expressions. But he had a brilliant turn of phrase. He was a fantastic communicator, and also his ability, to have the dramatic pause, and the way that he said things was just, really grab people's attention. He clearly had gravitas, charisma when he did it. He faced a lot of opposition from within his own people. He was mistrusted. He was seen as, an upstart or whatever. But yet, I think people had tremendous respect for him at the same time. He was a man who clearly was passionate about what he was talking about. He was passionate about his politics. He was passionate about the community that he lived in, and he would go anywhere to talk in the interests or on behalf of his community. He used to say that republicanism is not contagious. I'm happy to go and talk to any Republican, which as Tom knows, he did, and he would go anywhere to make his case, to speak for his people, to defend. Sometimes, well, he didn't. It was very interesting. He was very reluctant to defend the indefensible, and sometimes one of the things I think about that he had as a politician was he knew when not to speak, and he was prepared to hold his own counsel, and particularly to do things away from the spotlight of the media, to do things quietly, to do things in a more diplomatic way. And for a politician to turn down publicity is a very difficult thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll just tell you one. I had a bite to eat with him one night here in Hollywood. We were in the then Wine & Co., myself and my wife, David and Jeanette. And I said to him, will you come over to Ned's for a pint? I don't know if you were there that night, Stephen. And he says to me, would that be all right? I said, of course it would be all right. And we went over into Ned's Friday evening, bar bunged. Everybody wanted to touch him. They wanted to shake his hand. They wanted to hug him. They wanted to tell him that he was different, that they appreciated what he was trying to do. And, I tell this story about having a pint with him in the BBC Club one night. And he told me that Adams had called him. Gerry Adams wanted to make a speech where he was going to speak to the unionist community, and he asked David, what should he say? And David said to him, ask Paisley, is his war over? And, he was obviously expecting, Adams was obviously expecting, well, you need to say this, that, and the other for us. Yeah. But instead, what he wanted him to do was challenge Paisley. And that's what I mean about him being different. That we have interviewed numerous politicians along the way. You would go along knowing what they were going to say. You could have written a script before you spoke to them. With Irvine, it was different. There was always another line, another way. Not afraid to speak out about what was going on in his own community. As you say, refusing to defend the indefensible. Jackie, you were about in 94. I remember you saying to me at one stage that you didn't think the ceasefire was a good idea. You thought there was a bit of business to be done or sorted out before that. John will give you the mic, and remember you're in church.
It wasn't just as simple as that, Barney. It was I got out of prison in '94, February '94, and there had been rumours and gossip about the IRA declaring a ceasefire. And I said that my fellow prisoners, the IRA will not call a ceasefire unless there's a deal been done about the prisoners. And to a man, the UDA fellow prisoners I was with says, we don't want to get out if it's the IRA's getting us out. Mm-hmm. You know, so, and I says, well, they're going to have a vote on it. And I says, it wouldn't be right for me to say anything because I'm getting out next month. Some of you are here for a long time. So I leave, that's my opinion. I'll leave it to you. And when we got out, people like myself who had been arrested, but when we got out, we were on gardening leave. Not sure what happened to your ones, Tom. Our positions would have been filled by other people, so I wasn't party to any negotiation about the ceasefire or anything else. I got called to talk one of social club one night, along with about 200 other people. And I saw this crowd on the stage, and there was about 6 people on the stage, and I only respected one person, Gary McMichael. The rest I had little or nothing to do with, and they're all away. They weren't about anywhere now. But they were saying, we're calling a ceasefire. And I says, well, I've been in this organisation 22 years. I'd like to think I would have been sort of consulted about this. And what my problem was, Joe Bertie, Remy Elder, Ray Smallwood had just been murdered. And I says, I didn't want them to declare a ceasefire and then somebody go and break it. It wasn't that I didn't want a ceasefire, I wanted it to be timed properly. And I said to Martin McGuinness, sat in Meaber in the Falls Library, that I thought that's what the Provies did. But I says, those lads haven't been avenged yet. And the people at the top table says to me, you've had plenty of time to avenge them. And that was that. See, there was no consultation. There was just, and when Gusty said he's speaking for everybody, he wasn't speaking for everybody because everybody didn't know what was going to happen. You know, and
he was
some of the stuff I've heard.
Leadership is what you mean, Jackie? Yeah. He was speaking to a leadership decision, is that what you mean?
Yeah, but and listen to some of the stuff, and it's fantastic. You know, but we were never at that level. And we're still not at that level. You know, we're still on the outside looking in. But the role we have played and getting us this far. The one thing I regret a few things, of course, but I would just really have loved to see John McMichael and David Irvine working as a team because they had the same ideals. John was talking to the official IRA 2 years before he was killed. And we said to each other, I was very, very close to John, of course. He says, we're killing each other now, but it can't go on. We'll have to stop doing this. We'll have to move on. And I think that's one of the reasons why John was killed, or by whatever our allegations were. But John was like David, he saw the future. And when I heard some of the things David said, I wasn't too fond of David early on because a couple of things happened. But I said to some of my friends at the time, see if this goes wrong, David may get the boat. Mm-hmm. You know, but he was brave and he stuck by. And everybody then wanted, it's the same as the Hugh Madden stuff, everybody wanted somebody to talk peace. Mm-hmm. And so they gave David the opportunity. Mm-hmm. John McMichael never got the opportunity. Mm-hmm. And there was other people there that we were just to make up the numbers, really. Mm-hmm. And it was really, I was glad that the ceasefire took place and people didn't break it, because it would have made the whole organisation look stupid. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't that I didn't want it. I wanted it to be right. No, discipline would have been, McMichael's key word was always discipline, and seeing what was ahead of us.
Yeah. Thanks, Jackie. Thank you.
Jackie,
thank you. I think you get a little indication of how far we've come, you know, when you can bring the very many different voices across our communities into the one space. And we don't have to agree with Jackie's truth or Tom's truth. We just have to agree with, that's what they think, it's their opinion. And if we could do a wee bit more of that, we could get a little bit further down the road. I find in these conversations I come away with much more hope than when I stand for a day or two in the Great Hall at Stormont. You know, I think people who were in the trenches of this have a better understanding of the value of peace and how far we've got.
But you say that's your weakness.
Yeah.
You spend too much time listening to politicians.
Yeah.
You spend more time listening to ordinary people, real people.
I think I do a bit of that.
I don't spend much time. I don't spend much time on the Hill.
Yeah.
I
don't now.
Much time spending listening to what's been said from people on the Hill.
Yeah.
Except when it's important things have to be said, obviously. But when you see what else is happening in the wider community, and it's amazing how you can fall into little small pockets of just hope, and you go, where does this come from? And they would say, we've been doing this for 20 years. Really? And then you say, the next thing out of my mouth is, well, why hasn't it been in the news?
Yeah.
And then I look at myself and say, just shot myself in the foot. Why didn't I report that 20 years ago when I still had the opportunity to do so? But you know, there are lots of things happening out there in the community at all different levels.
Yeah.
And they're very positive things, and they're not all people who've been involved directly in the conflict. There's another generation involved in stuff, particularly even around things like the peace wall up in the Shankill and the Falls. There's youth groups working through the gates when they're open to try and bring about, you know, the dismantling of that at some stage. I know it's well behind schedule and all the rest of it, but still things are happening. So that'll bring you nicely on to a man who spoke about all things
bright and beautiful, no?
Bright and beautiful after the just prior to and just around the ceasefire time. And the decommissioning of weapons.
Yeah,
Ronnie Flanagan.
So we'll ask David and Harold Good's with us as well. We'll maybe bring them up to the front, and this will be our last clip, and we'll get 2 short responses from David and Harold, and then we'll take a question or two before we wrap up. But this is a conversation I had with Ronnie Flanagan at police headquarters in August 1997. The ceasefire had just been restored in July. The government had indicated that Sinn Féin would be allowed to join talks in September 1997, but we were still in this standoff over the question of arms and what would happen in terms of decommissioning or not happen. And this is Ronnie Flanagan explaining to me the difference between the policing considerations around decommissioning and the political consideration around decommissioning. And you'll hear him begin by saying, we'll talk off the record. He was one of the people I told recently that I was applying the 30-year rule, even though we haven't got the 30 years with this tape because it was 97. I'm applying the 27-year rule to this tape. But this is Ronnie Flanagan on the question of arms.
Well, let me speak off the record first, Brian, because it is difficult being a political issue. Yes. But the truth is, from a security point of view, that the major threat posed to us by the IRA is through their engineering capability, their ability to improvise weaponry and explosives. And the truth is, you cannot decommission engineering knowledge. If you comprise the threat as of 2 major elements, the ability to engage in violence through not only expertise but access to materials, and the other element being the will to engage in violence. What surely is much more important is to eliminate the will to engage in violence, and it doesn't matter whether the ability is there or not if there's no will to use it. Now, that's from a security point of view. But we would accept that there are political dimensions. There's a question of confidence building. There's a question of a demonstration of absolute commitment, and that becomes more than mere symbolism. And those are issues and decisions that governments have to make.
I've come to the view that the Prime Minister, John Major, Secretary of State, Patrick Mayhew, listened to Flanagan in that period of 95 into early 96, then maybe the ceasefire would not have broken down in February. I think he had a much better sense of the pulse of this place. I played that clip for the first time at Fela, Belfast, at the start of August this year. And I'm not going to get into names, but a senior Republican spoke to me afterwards. I don't mean senior in terms of like Tom or Jim. He had been a senior IRA figure in the conflict period. And he said to me, I think we've misread him, we've misread Flanagan. You know, we thought he was messing in 94 and 95 around the ceasefire period. And I think when he heard him speak on that arms question, he took another view. And I said to him, I can remember a moment in March 1999, they were still fighting over the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement. David, you'll remember, still fighting over guns, no government. And Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair had arrived at Hillsborough again. And Flanagan had said to me a few weeks previously, he says, watch out for Mandela's intervention. And I said, what do you mean Mandela's intervention? He says he's going to speak to the party leaders. And he said, I don't want you to breathe a word about that. And if you do breathe a word about it, he says, I'll find out. You know, in other words, he'll have heard it in one of the listening circles that they would have been in. And in March 1999, I went to take a statement from the IRA as Blair and Ahern arrived. And I thought, this will be about arms. It'll be about what's happening at Hillsborough. And in fact, it was about the bodies of the disappeared, the IRA saying at that stage that they believed they'd identified 9 of the graves, that they tried to find the burial site of Robert Narak and were unable to do so. And that became the news headline of that night. But within an hour of it going out, this story broke that Nelson Mandela had been in contact with Gerry Adams, Seamus Mallon and David Trimble at Hillsborough. And what that said to me was that Flanagan in that policing role also understood better than some of our politicians the need for international influence, the need for process, that yes, in the ideal world you would want guns decommissioned immediately. But he also understood that Adams and McGuinness were managing an organisation in the way that he would have to manage the policing organisation soon after when the RUC title would go. But David, give us a few words then about that whole arms question. And then, of course, Harold not only becomes involved in our decommissioning process here, but becomes a witness to decommissioning in the Basque Country, and I'm just back from there. And he reminded me yesterday over a cup of coffee about the axe that's buried in the Basque Country after decommissioning, burying the hatchet. And I think we were talking about, have we managed to do that yet, Harold? So if David says a few words, Harold says a few words, and then hopefully we'll have time for a question or two before we wrap up. David Kerr was spokesman for David Trimble on the morning of the Good Friday Agreement. He was 24 years of age at that stage. He's now 34. Still a young man, and probably the most difficult job in politics at that stage, anyone who was a spokesman for David Trimble. So David Kerr.
Thanks very much. Good evening, everybody. There's a lot of things could be said about that period, but when we talk about decommissioning, I was at an event in the Oireachtas in May of last year, and I was on a panel with Gerry Adams and some other notable people, and there was an exchange between myself, I suppose, and Gerry in front of the assembled audience. And I still, to this day, and I noticed it in his own remarks that night, I still don't think anybody in Sinn Féin ever really truly understood the significance of decommissioning to unionism in 1998 or 1999 or 2000. For us, it was about trust, because we knew what a deal, or what a big deal it was to the IRA if they were going to commence decommissioning. It was hugely symbolic for republicanism, and it was a Rubicon over which many, many people in the IRA were not willing to cross. And we knew within unionism, we didn't have a paramilitary organisation in the Ulster Unionist Party. We were the largest unionist party at that time. David Trimble, I think, was the leader of unionism, but we were very much a civic organisation. And for us to go into government with Sinn Féin, or to contemplate going into government, never mind that, even going into talks before that, with Sinn Féin, was hugely challenging to our people. Within the unionist community, you had a massive trauma, and it's still there within people who were affected by the violence that took place between 69 and 94 and 98 even. So we had a huge gulf of trust, and we needed decommissioning to happen. As you will probably know, in that period in 1998, we didn't get decommissioning. We ended up with ambiguous language around it in the Good Friday Agreement, which we tried to say was much more explicit than we knew it actually was. We tried numerous times in 1999, when there were summit talks, and Barney's just referred to them, to try to leverage and entice Sinn Féin to move towards us on that issue before we would go into government. We then got to the position at the end of 1999, as you may remember, where David Trimble famously got a vote through the Ulster Unionist Council saying, "We've jumped, Mr. Adams, now you follow." Decommissioning didn't actually happen then until September, October 2001.
That's right.
And it really only happened because of 9/11. And despite all the pressure that we had put on, despite all the problems that we had had trying to get the IRA to move, to in some way pacify the unionist community that it was okay to allow Sinn Féin to come into government, they wouldn't move. But when 9/11 happened, terrorism overnight in the United States became a dirty word. And Irish America, we knew and we heard very quickly after that, turned on, we believe, Sinn Féin and the IRA leadership and said, look, you have to move. And I think it happened not long after that. There was an awful lot of work went into all of that. There was an awful lot of risks. There were a lot of risks taken politically by us. And I don't think anybody will ever understand the work that went into that to bring the unionist community along that road to getting Stormont up and running the first time. Tom has talked about the quiet people in the background in the peace process. There were a huge number of people within unionism and within loyalism who were advocates for political progress, for reconciliation, for taking risks, because they knew how hard conflict was. And Tom has said sometimes conflict is easier than compromise. And that was the case, because we had a hell of a lot of people in unionism who were actually quite comfortable with conflict because it was easier than compromise. But we pushed on and we persevered, and I think a lot of good people who have never had their names shone in the bright lights or written in the history books supported us on that journey. And I want to say something else. Decommissioning was about trust, and when we eventually crossed that bridge, I think there was a watershed moment with that within our own party at that time, within the Ulster Unionist Party, and within unionism, that things are changing. These people are serious about peace. Even though we may have found out that the IRA was also procuring weapons, we understand at the same time. But symbolically, we knew it was a big deal. I want to say something else, that I've been out of politics actively anyway since 2002, and I was talking to the gentleman over there, Jackie, and his colleagues there earlier. What I have learned in terms of my observations of this process over the past 20-odd years, since the Good Friday Agreement, 25, 26 years now, when I look at it, I feel there are two ways you approach a problem like Northern Ireland, or the Israeli problem and the Palestinian problem. Or I spoke to some people from Cyprus, from Northern Cyprus and Southern Cyprus last year at Stormont as well. You can either choose a very difficult and messy political compromise with your enemy, or you can choose war. And what I heard and what I listened to an awful lot of the time around 1998, I was 24 years of age, time of the Good Friday Agreement, were an awful lot of people who spoke hardline political rhetoric. But when I challenged them, and David Trimble challenged them at that time, Well, do you want to back that up? Have you an appetite for the type of conflict required to get those things that you think you're entitled to? They didn't have it. They didn't have it. And I feel Northern Ireland as a society and as, you know, warring tribes and everything else, we had arrived at a very, very particular moment in our own development as a society and as a country here, where we had effectively accepted we can't keep doing this. We have to go for the difficult political compromise because it's the only way out of this. If we want to go for conflict, the price is inexcusably high and there's no support for it. What the Israelis are doing, I believe, at this point in time, is the other option. And I think the Israelis have concluded, and this is my personal view, that they're not going to do what happened in Northern Ireland. They're going to try to annihilate their opponents and their enemies before there's any peace talks. Now, we will watch this in real time, and as historians and as actors in what happened here, I hope I live long enough to see how that plays out. And it'll be very interesting to see how it plays out. But I'm happy with what we did in Northern Ireland because I think we did the right thing for the right reasons. Mm-hmm. And we saved a hell of a lot of lives and an awful lot of misery that we would have inflicted on each other had we carried on and not done what we did. So that's my tuppence worth. I think I will conclude with one final statement. And I said it last year on the 25th anniversary, and I appeal to people who understand politics and who understand what it takes in these processes. This is a 50-year project. The Good Friday Agreement is a 2-generation project. It's going to take 2 cycles of development in this society for us to move away from the trauma that we went through. I went through, certainly, growing up in Fermanagh, and all the impact that the Troubles had on my family and my friends and everybody else around me. I'll never probably reconcile a lot of the bitterness that I have, I suppose, in my heart towards people who did things to people in my community. But the next generation after me will. I believe that. So the duty upon us and leaders in this society now is to make sure that we keep moving this society forward, to make sure we keep building political progress. And if we keep doing that and we keep the show on the road to Stormont and the institutions running, I believe we'll get there and society here will evolve in the way that we want it to. Thanks very much.
Thanks, David. Harold, inevitably, you're going to end up with nearly the last word here tonight. I know this has happened to you before, but anyway.
Okay.
You can probably, in your own mind, I imagine, encapsulate a lot of what's already been said and put it in the context of where we are now and from where you were on a particular time and a particular date, watching with your own eyes the decommissioning of weaponry, which was such a major step forward in cementing the peace process and getting us to where we are now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have I got 3 minutes or 4?
2. 1.5.
I'm just listening to what David was saying there about the future. One of the concerns I have is there's another generation who ought to be sitting here hearing these stories, who have no idea, and worse, don't really care. I think of my own grandchildren, who now and again will say, "Granddad, what does that have?" Yeah, we need to help another generation understand something of the history and to help them to understand that in an objective way, not through our own narrow lenses, but in a general way, if we're going to avoid repetition of history. I was interested hearing Tom speak and speaking about the conversations that took place. There are many stories you could tell which people would say are quite unbelievable. And perhaps the most unbelievable one of all is of a Sinn Féin Lord Mayor of Belfast sitting with a Methodist minister on a Saturday afternoon on a train to Kilkenny.
helping the Methodist minister to write a sermon that he had to preach the next day to the British Legion service in St Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. Now, come on. Did I make that up? Tom, did I make that up? He asked me to be silent about that because he said he wanted to wait until both he and I have left this world and you can tell the story. But it's one of the kind of, I say it half, for fun, but actually it illustrates the kind of relationship that we developed in those years. I remember going to meetings where we were invited to come and meet folks from the other side. And I can remember one of those meetings where the only image I have was fingers waving at each other. People waving fingers at each other. Blame, wave, if you... and I decided I'm not going back to that gathering again. And I didn't. Instead, we engaged in very respectful but honest conversations. And I always say there are 3 T's in this process, and trust. And that was the basis on which many of us engaged in those conversations. And I suppose that's how I came into the story, the trust part. And I can remember the day when I was invited to Clonard Monastery, where we often met, but I was invited on this particular occasion to room 007. On that long corridor in Clonard, there's a room 007. And there, Father Alec and I were invited, asked if we would share in this new journey, the next step in the journey of decommissioning. And I remember that night very, very well. What a remarkable man, as you have said, Tom, about Father Alec, my beloved fellow traveller. He used to get me into a little bit of difficulty because quite often when we were making joint presentations, he would say, if I have the opportunity, I'm going to nominate Harold Good as Pope. And I'd say, Alec, don't you know I have enough trouble as it is without making that suggestion. But we had a wonderful, wonderful relationship, and all the things that Tom said about him are so true. A remarkable man. It was somebody who said, a journalist who said that in every conflict there's a no man's land into which few people dare to go. And she went on to say Father Alec was just such a person who went into the no man's land and invited some of the rest of us sometimes to go into that no man's land with him. The story has only been half told. But that was where our journey, his journey and mine began. And it was the first of many, many journeys that we made. First of all, along with those who were in charge of the decommissioning process. And again, what a remarkable General de Chastelain and his colleagues had sat long and late with the leadership of Sinn Féin and IRA to bring them to the place where there was a process that wasn't going to be surrender, but where they would take responsibility for the decommissioning. And again, I, by hand on heart, and say that process was 100% authentic. And as I journeyed with Alec throughout wherever we were taken, and I've no idea where all we were taken, but we watched that process day in, all day, and sat in the evenings and talked about it. And I would sit with those folks who were war-weary. And I would listen to their stories as they would talk about the comrades that they had lost in this conflict. I felt myself in a pastoral role, listening to the stories of grief and of loss and of pain and of hurt. And every evening, in one way or another, they would say, you know why we're doing this? We're doing this for our children and their children. And then somebody else said, and everybody's children. And that was the spirit in which we engaged in that process, in that journey. There are many parts of this story. People sometimes say, oh, thank you. And I say, listen, this was a jigsaw. We made piece by piece. Each of us had a little piece to put into that jigsaw to make the picture complete. But, I was watching people make jigsaws the other day, and they were all very reluctant to break it up at the end because it looked so good and so pretty. Let's make sure we don't break up this particular. It is a puzzlement in some ways as to how we got where we are, but we are where we are. Thank God for that. And it's perhaps, as somebody has said, it's the beginning of the next stage in our journey, and we must not in any way let our children and their children down by drawing back in any way. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. Thank you very much. We have got a little time, not a lot of time, a little time, depending on how long your answers are, for a couple of questions, perhaps. So any hands shoot up, go ahead, now's the time.
We're not going to let a man ask a question. We've had enough men speak. So we'll have 3 questions from the women.
There we go.
There we are. One,
back left.
And then we'll take the 3 of them and then we'll answer. Is that it? Yeah?
If you like.
Yeah, we'll do it that way. Yeah, up here. Yeah. Don't feel any pressure.
Thank you very much. I must say, everybody speaking was just fantastic, and I really enjoyed hearing the individual perspectives. My question is, what is our understanding of the sacrifices that Gerry Adams made in, stepping forward and meeting with John Hume, etc., in relation to, I think, I've always had a sense that they walked a very fine line between, accepting, in inverted commas, that Stormont prevails and that the state of Northern Ireland prevails, and that, what was it all for, really, and how you bring your kind of collective with you. Yeah. So, and I mean, I'm not a Republican or anything. No. I don't know why I'm saying that, but...
it's a perfectly reasonable question.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. We'll take 2 more, and then we'll try to answer them, and we'll go.
Does not to be 2, it could be 1.
One more. Here we are. This is great.
Thank you. Just stand up.
Yeah.
Just want to say thank you, first of all. I am one of those children, one of those grandchildren. I was born in February 1998, just before the Good Friday Agreement was signed. It's so important to have discussions like this so that people like me can hear the multitude of perspectives that maybe I didn't hear in my home whenever I was growing up. My question as a young journalist is, how did you create that relationship of trust that so many people from all different perspectives were able to speak to you so openly, even if it was off the record?
Dan, thank you. Well, in terms of Gerry Adams, there would have been no peace process without Gerry Adams. There would have been no ceasefire without Gerry Adams. That's not to condone in any way 30 years of violence. It's a statement of fact that the peace process would not have been possible without the IRA leadership and the loyalist leaderships arriving at a position where they realised there was a military stalemate. You had British generals, you had a Secretary of State speaking at that time of the early 90s, talking about difficult to envisage a military defeat of the IRA. And my understanding, and Tom and Jim who are here would understand this better than I would, that then asked the question within the IRA, can we militarily defeat the British? And the answer was no. And therefore you had to begin to explore the possibilities of peace. And there was a reference about decommissioning not being surrender. And the ceasefires were not surrender. And peace is not surrender. It's a compromise, and it's this constant work in progress. I think, and I've said it out loudly a number of times recently, that the Nobel Peace Prize should have been in a much wider frame. It should not just have been John Hume and David Trimble. It should have been an acknowledgement of those quiet peacemakers who, first of all, made the ceasefires possible. And you know, Tom has mentioned some of them, Father Alec Reid, Robin Eames, the people in the back channel, Harold Good, years later in the decommissioning process. So I think a peace recognition that recognised both the parts of the process, the ceasefires and then the political agreement, and recognised the parties to that peace and political agreement would have been a much fairer outcome and a much better decision. To speak to your question about when I started out on all of this, you don't find the IRA number in John Kyle's Yellow Pages, you know, or the Combined Loyalist Military Command number in John Kyle's Yellow Pages. So I don't know what took me down that road. We were put out of our home in 1974. I can only think that it was that experience of the 1970s that made me want to find out some more about what happened here. And I took a decision when I started to do this that I wasn't going to do it talking with one side. I was going to try to talk to all the sides, and we're a bigger place than two sides that are quite often talked about here. There are many sides to this conflict, and if there is ever a process on legacy and some answering of our past, then it's not just the IRA and the loyalists and the state that need to be there. It's the churches, it's the media, it's those who had influence and didn't use it, who acquiesced in the conflict period. So all of those relationships broke down over the years. They were never cozy, and nor should they ever have been cozy. But the word that Harold and David talked about, trust, it's about building trust. That takes a long, long time. There were moments when I could have seen it far enough. If you ask me would I do it again, probably not. I'm very fortunate that I got out the other end of this. There were times when I worried about myself and my family and many other people. But it was a huge privilege, as well as a huge challenge, to report a conflict, particularly when you live in the middle of it, and you're reporting to your own people. So it was that nosiness, it was that wanting to know, it was learning how to do it and making mistakes as I learned how to do it. And you know what I do now is I rewind all of this in my head all the time about what I got right and what I got wrong and what I could have done better and what I should have done better. You know, and I've said many times that many people report conflict. I had to put myself beside the sides in this conflict, not in terms of any foreknowledge of what was going to happen, but clearly speaking with people who knew what was going to happen next and who knew what had just happened. And so that is a huge reporting challenge. And I think all I can contribute to this conversation is what I learned along the way. You know, there's no book that says this is how you report conflict. So when and Mervyn and I spoke recently to journalists from Palestinian and Israeli journalists, and you know, I made that point to them that if all you're doing is reporting Hamas, or if all you're doing is reporting the IDF, you're not reporting a conflict. You're taking lines. You know, news is what you can't see. You know, news is what you've got to learn about. News is what's around the corner, and so it's building that wide range of sources, and never parroting information. You know, getting your information, testing it, and thankfully for us, in our time, in the madness of that conflict, we had time to think. You know, in today's social media age, you know, where news is Twitter or X or Facebook or Instagram, there's not that same time. So
Or lies.
Our lies, yeah, you know, are not wrong for long. You know, in my day, when you got it wrong, you had to explain why you got it wrong, and if there was a good reason for getting it wrong, that was okay. If it was careless, it wasn't okay. So I just think, go find the people, you know, who are important to the story. Not one person. Go find the people. And then do what Harold talked about. Make the jigsaw piece by piece. You know, and you won't always have all of the pieces. And in conflict, there is no such thing as a perfect reporting record. But if you do your best, you know, and if you test your information, and if you speak it honestly, and I spoke at times in this conflict on the news when I knew I was doing damage to the peace process, but it wasn't my job to blow trumpets for it. It was my job to report it. So it's that dividing line between your citizenship and your work responsibility, and that's a tug of war. But I'm glad you're here.
And if anybody asks you about the peace, just say it's not a perfect peace, but it's a lot better than what it was.
Yeah, yeah.
And we aren't
Tom,
killing each other on
yeah.
a daily basis or
Yeah.
blowing the centres out of our towns,
Yeah.
villages.
Tom, yeah. Yeah.
Earlier on, I said that negotiations are a very human process.
Yeah, yeah.
And it strikes me that, you know, from a media point of view, you'll ask David, well, what's he willing to compromise?
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me that David, as a unionist, and John, and Jackie, and Harold, all of us are involved in a negotiating process, and we bump into each other somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, yeah.
And the secret of a negotiating process is that it creates something new.
Mm-hmm.
David, talking to Gerry or talking to Martin, created something new.
Yes.
And sometimes in the hurly-burly of daily politics, and particularly of a media that can't often, you know, are you willing to compromise? What they don't talk about is what all these people created. It wasn't easy.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not meant to be easy.
Yeah, yeah.
It was difficult, but they created something new.
Yeah.
And that is the sustaining power of negotiations.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is I've got to know all of these people. You know, I've been for a pint with them. That doesn't mean to say that that's cosy. You know, people used to say to me about, you know, I saw you with Gibney and Hartley, or I saw you with David Irvine, or I saw you with, you know, I remember a guy confronting me in a restaurant here in Hollywood. It was with Peter Robinson and Timmy Johnson of the DUP. Who's paying for this lunch? I thought you were meant to be neutral. I said, I'm paying for all 3 lunches. You know, he said to me when I got back to the newsroom, he should put his head down the toilet. Now that would have been a great news story. I thought he was coming over to give off to Robinson, but he was coming over to give off to me. But how do you sit in a studio, or in a radio studio, or how do you write in a newspaper without knowing what's inside people's minds? And the only way you find out what's inside people's minds is by getting to know them. And I think finding, you know, a way where we all get to know each other, as Tom has described. That doesn't mean to say we have to agree with everything we say. We've got to agree to disagree. But building those understandings and relationships there's no substitute for that. You know, and it's not easy. And it's hard and it's difficult, and at times you ask yourself, why am I doing this? And I'm sure they're asking themselves, why are we talking to him? But that's what happens. You know, you've got to know each other. Harold, last word.
Just to follow that, it was often been, thanks. People have said and will say, you know, you seem to spend most of your time and your focus talking to Republicans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, they say, could you spend all your time talking to them? And I say, well, you know, if I was an architect and I was asked to build a bridge, I would spend what might seem to be an inordinate amount of time getting to understand the other side of the chasm. the side with which I am less familiar, if I want to build a bridge, rather than focusing on the side that I am familiar with. If I only did that, the bridge would have a very short lifespan.
You're right. You're right. Last word from
Final
David.
word.
Anybody else got a last word?
Your
He stole the microphone.
Your question about Gerry Adams and his role in the process is a very good question. I can tell you from our own point of view in 1998, 97, 96, we didn't want to speak to Sinn Féin. We were so, to be honest, we were just so bitter. The hatred towards Sinn Féin and what the IRA had done, I suppose, during the Troubles was just so toxic, and it was just so difficult for us. And Tom's absolutely right that it took us, we didn't speak to them before the Good Friday Agreement in a bilateral sense. Yes, they attended roundtable meetings, but the first time we sat down and we had a meal with them was in the autumn of 1999, and I had lunch with Senator George Mitchell at Queen's a few weeks ago, which was very kindly organised by the university, and George Mitchell started talking about this. So George Mitchell invited us to Winfield House, the residence of the American ambassador in London, and the first night we were there, it was just the Ulster and Sinn Féin's delegation. And the first night we were there, George insisted that we were all having dinner together. And of course, we were incredibly uncomfortable with this. But we thought, well, we can't say no to George Mitchell. We're going to have to go. And it may sound trivial and people may think, oh, he's making more of it than it was. But it was a profound event in my own life and my own memory of that period, when we sat down, 7 or 8 of us on one side of the table, and Gerry Adams and Jerry Kelly and Martin McGuinness and others on the other side. But the communication that then followed from that, and there were meetings, there were some meetings between Trimble and Adams, obviously, as well. But that breaking of the ice, that normalisation of dialogue, was the start of something new. It was. And no matter what way you look at these types of conflicts and how bad they can get, the only way out of it, if it isn't through the utter annihilation of your opponent, is through dialogue and through communication. And I will say this to you, that I don't think we ever fully appreciated the lengths that Gerry Adams was probably going to at that time to bring the IRA with him on that journey, because we knew the IRA was full of people who were much more comfortable with conflict than peace. And he probably didn't get the recognition for it. Now, I know he's a wily operator and he's a very clever and strategic person, but it was something that Sinn Féin would have said to us at the time in those years. Do you not realise how difficult it is for us? You think it's difficult for you. Do you not realise how difficult it is for us? But all of that comes back to communication and dialogue and getting to know each other and having an honest conversation about what's actually going on in each other's communities. And that's the great lesson of that period for me.
Thank you, David. Folks, that's it. On that bombshell, as you say. I hope you got something from it tonight. Again, if you haven't got the copy of the book, please get one on the way out. Take it home, read, inwardly digest, and hopefully you'll get something out of it you haven't already heard or read about. But thank you for coming, and thanks to Brian Rowan for writing the book.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.